My name is Valeria, and I'm 26 years old. I never thought words could cut deeper than physical pain until my mother screamed, all my sacrifices met with nothing but disappointment. Those 7 words shattered everything between us. With tears burning my eyes, I walked away that night, not just from our house, but from her expectations. The look on her face stays with me, a mixture of anger and dismissal that fueled my determination to prove her wrong. If you're watching this, drop a comment, letting me know where you're from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to prove someone wrong who should have believed in you from the start. Now let me tell you how I turned my mother's disappointment into my greatest motivation. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Boston in a small 2-bedroom apartment that always smelled like my mother's borscht and father's aftershave. My parents, Natasha and Mikhail, immigrated from Russia when they were in their early 20s, chasing the ever-elusive American dream. They left behind their families, their culture, and their language, all for the promise of better opportunities for themselves and eventually for me. The financial struggles were constant, even though both my parents worked multiple jobs. My father drove a taxi during the day and worked as a maintenance man in the evenings. My mother cleaned houses in the mornings and waited tables at a Russian restaurant at night. They would come home exhausted, feet swollen, hands rough from labor, yet they never complained. It was all for me, they'd say, all so that I could have the opportunities they never had. My love for writing began when I was 8 years old. Mrs. Patterson, my 3rd grade teacher, gave us an assignment to write a short story about our greatest adventure. While the other kids wrote about Disney World or summer camp, I crafted a tale about a young girl who discovered a magical doorway in her closet that led to her parents' homeland. The girl would travel between worlds, bringing back stories and traditions to keep her heritage alive. Mrs. Patterson read my story aloud to the class, her voice rising and falling with the narrative. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. That was the first time I felt the power of my words, the first time I understood that I could create worlds and emotions with just a pen and paper. When I brought the story home, my mother's eyes lit up with pride. She hung it on our refrigerator with a magnet shaped like the Kremlin that she'd brought from Moscow. "My Valerichka," she said, using her special nickname for me, "you have such imagination." Every night after dinner, I would write stories for my parents. My father would listen intently, his tired eyes sparkling with interest. My mother would smile and stroke my hair, calling me her little American writer. Those were golden moments when the strains of immigrant life seemed to fade away, replaced by the simple joy of storytelling. But as I entered high school, the dynamic began to change. My mother's encouragement of my creativity waned, replaced by constant reminders about the importance of practical career paths. "Writing is a hobby, Valeria," she would say. "Medicine, law, business. These are careers that will feed you." I tried to explain that writing could be a viable career too, that there were successful authors who made good livings. But my mother would just shake her head. "For every successful writer, there are thousands who starve," she would counter. I did not come to America for my daughter to starve. My father was more supportive, but in a quiet, almost secretive way. He would slip me books by Russian and American authors when my mother wasn't looking. "Read these," he would whisper. "Learn from the masters." But he never openly contradicted my mother's wishes. In their relationship, she was the backbone, the decision-maker, the one who charted the course for our family's future. Despite the growing pressure at home, I excelled in school, particularly in English and literature classes. My essays consistently earned top marks, and my short stories won school competitions. By sophomore year, I was the editor of the school literary magazine, spending hours after classes selecting submissions and designing layouts. I still remember the day I won the state writing competition at 16. The theme was heritage and identity, and I had poured my heart into a story about a first-generation American struggling to balance her parents' traditions with her own American identity. When they announced my name at the ceremony, I nearly floated to the stage, my heart pounding with excitement. My father attended the ceremony, clapping so hard his hands turned red. My mother had to work, but I couldn't wait to tell her. I imagined her face lighting up with pride, perhaps finally seeing that my writing wasn't just a hobby, but a genuine talent with potential. When I got home waving the certificate and the small trophy, my mother looked up from preparing dinner and offered a tight smile. "Very nice," she said. "But did you finish your calculus homework?" Dr. Petrov's daughter just got accepted to Harvard Medical School. She always focused on her studies, not competitions. The trophy found its place on my bookshelf, partially hidden behind textbooks. That night, I cried silently into my pillow, not understanding why my passion was so threatening to my mother. why she couldn't see that words, not numbers, made my soul come alive. Senior year of high school brought a new Battlefield College applications. I applied to multiple schools, including some with prestigious writing programs like Northwestern Columbia and the University of Iowa. I also, to appease my mother, applied to schools known for their business and pre-med programs. The acceptances started rolling in during spring, including one from Northwestern University, with a partial scholarship for their creative writing program. I was ecstatic already, imagining myself on campus, surrounded by like-minded peers who understood the power of storytelling. But when I showed the acceptance letter to my mother, her reaction was ice cold. Northwestern for writing. She practically spat the word. I did not work cleaning toilets for 15 years, so you could waste your education on fairy tales. Boston University offered you pre-med. That is the sensible choice. The argument that followed was explosive, taking place over our dinner table, still laden with half-eaten pelmeni and beet salad. My mother's voice rose with each point, her accent becoming thicker as her emotions intensified. You think writing will pay your bills? You think publishers are waiting for another immigrant story? Wake up, Valeria. This is America. You need a real degree for a real job. My father tried to mediate, his soft voice, a stark contrast to my mother's sharp tones. Natasha, perhaps we can find a compromise. Northwestern is an excellent school, very prestigious. But my mother turned on him too. You encourage this fantasy, Mikhail, always filling her head with stories instead of sense. She turned back to me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Everything we have done has been for you. All the hours, all the humiliation, all the sacrifice, for you to throw away on a useless degree. In the end, I compromised. I would attend Northwestern, but I would double major in business administration and English. It wasn't what I truly wanted, but it was the only solution that would bring some peace to our home. My mother accepted the compromise with tight lips and a curt nod, as if she was granting me a tremendous favor. When August came, I moved into my dorm room at Northwestern with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The campus was beautiful with its Gothic buildings and view of Lake Michigan. For the first time in my life, I was away from my mother's watchful eye, free to make my own decisions. My creative writing classes were everything I had hoped for and more. Professor Diane Winters, a published novelist with kind eyes and a no-nonsense approach to critiques, took a special interest in my work. Your stories have an authenticity to them, she told me after class one day. The tension between cultures, between generations. It's compelling. Keep digging deeper. In my business classes, I struggled to maintain interest. Microeconomics, accounting principles, marketing strategies. They all felt like foreign languages to me, technical and devoid of the human element that made writing so fulfilling. I studied diligently, determined to keep my grades up to justify my choice to my mother, but my heart wasn't in it. I made new friends who valued my writing talents. Zach, a film major who wanted to adapt my stories for short films. Emma, a fellow English major who stayed up late with me discussing character development and plot structures. Jacob, a philosophy student who challenged my perspectives and pushed me to think deeper. With them, I felt seen and understood in a way I never had before. But phone calls home became increasingly tense. My mother would interrogate me about my business classes, asking about internship opportunities and networking events. When I mentioned my writing accomplishments, a story published in the university literary magazine, praise from Professor Winters, an award from the English department, she would quickly change the subject or offer a dismissive, "That's nice, but how are your accounting grades?" Each dismissal chipped away at my confidence, at my belief in my own abilities. I found myself second-guessing my choices, wondering if perhaps my mother was right. Was I being selfish, pursuing a passion that might never pay the bills? Was I dishonoring my parents' sacrifices by choosing a path so different from what they had envisioned for me? During her first visit to campus in my sophomore year, my mother walked through my dorm room with a critical eye, noting the books stacked on every surface, the literary quotes I had pinned to my bulletin board, the absence of business textbooks on my desk. "You are not taking this seriously," she said, picking up a copy of my latest short story draft. "All these stories about sad immigrant families and cultural confusion. Who wants to read this? Americans want happy stories, success stories. Not this, dwelling in difficulties." I tried to explain that authentic writing often explores challenges and conflicts, that some of the greatest literature comes from examining painful truths. But she waved away my explanations like annoying flies, more concerned with whether I had applied for the business internship she had found through a friend of a friend. By the time she left, I felt drained, as if all the joy had been sucked out of my creative pursuits. It took days of reassurance from my friends and Professor Winters to rebuild my confidence to remember why I had chosen this path in the first place. As senior year approached, I found myself at a crossroads once again. My business courses had provided me with a practical foundation that I knew would please my mother, but my passion for writing had only grown stronger during my time at Northwestern. Professor Winters had taken me under her wing, encouraging me to apply to Master of Fine Arts programs in creative writing. "You have a unique voice, Valeria," she told me during one of our mentoring sessions. "Your perspective as a first-generation American, your understanding of cultural duality, these are powerful tools in your writing. You shouldn't waste this talent." With her guidance, I secretly applied to several prestigious MFA programs, including Columbia, NYU, and the Iowa Writers' Workshop. I didn't tell my parents, knowing that even the suggestion would spark another war at home. In early March of my senior year, 2 significant events occurred within days of each other. First, I received an acceptance letter from NYU's MFA program, complete with a partial teaching fellowship that would help cover the tuition. Second, a prestigious literary magazine accepted one of my short stories for publication, a piece about a young immigrant woman finding her voice through art. I was ecstatic, practically floating as I packed my bag to head home for spring break. For the first time, I felt confident enough to stand my ground with my mother. I had proof now, tangible evidence that my writing had value, that others in the literary world saw potential in me. Surely even my mother couldn't dismiss these accomplishments. The family dinner on my first night home started pleasantly enough. My father had prepared his famous beef stroganoff, and my mother had even baked my favorite honey cake for dessert. They asked about my classes, about graduation plans, about job applications. I answered their questions while gathering my courage, waiting for the right moment to share my news. After dinner, as we sat around the living room with cups of tea, I took a deep breath and pulled out the acceptance letter and the magazine with my published story. "I have some exciting news," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "NYU has accepted me into their MFA program in creative writing, and this magazine has published my short story. It's one of the top literary publications in the country." My father's face lit up with a proud smile, but my mother's expression darkened immediately. She put down her teacup with a sharp clink against the saucer. "MFA, more school for writing." Her voice was quiet at first, deceptively calm. "And when does this program start?" "September," I answered. "And I'll have a teaching fellowship that covers part of the tuition." "Captivated, sites." "And the rest?" "Who pays for that?" "And your apartment in New York? Your food, your bills?" Her voice rose with each question. "We did not save for you to waste more time and money on this hobby." "It's not a hobby, Mom. It's my career choice. Look at the magazine. They paid me for my story. This is just the beginning. I can teach, write work in publishing." "All my sacrifices met with nothing but disappointment," she suddenly shouted, rising from her chair, the teacup falling to the carpet. "I cleaned houses, I served food to rude Americans, I worked when I was sick, when I was tired, when I wanted to give up. For what? So my daughter can be a starving artist, so she can struggle like we struggled." The room fell silent except for my mother's heavy breathing. My father sat frozen, his eyes darting between us, his mouth slightly open as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. "Say something," I pleaded with him. "Tell her this is important to me. Tell her you believe in me." But my father remained silent, his gaze dropping to the floor. His silence felt like a betrayal, worse than my mother's words. He had always been my quiet supporter, my secret ally. Now when I needed him most, he had abandoned me to my mother's fury. As my mother continued listing all the sacrifices she had made for me, the jobs she had taken, the humiliations she had endured, the dreams she had deferred, I felt something break inside me. A lifetime of seeking approval, of trying to balance my dreams with her expectations, of compromising my passion to honor her sacrifices. It all came crashing down in that moment. Tears burned my eyes as the terrible realization dawned on me. My mother would never support my dreams. No achievement would ever be enough. No publication, no degree, no success would ever convince her that my chosen path had value. "I'm going to NYU," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm going to be a writer. I'm sorry that disappoints you, but I can't live my life for you anymore." I walked out of the house that night, the screen door slamming behind me with a finality that echoed in my chest. I walked for blocks, tears streaming down my face, until I found myself at Maya's house, my childhood friend who had stayed local for college. Maya listened as I poured out everything: the fight, the years of disapproval, the impossible weight of my parents' expectations. When I finished, she handed me a tissue and squeezed my hand. "You know what I've always admired about you, Val? Your stories. Even when we were kids, you could make words do things no one else could. If your mum can't see that gift, it's her loss. But don't you dare give it up for her. The world needs your voice." That night, sleeping on Maya's couch, I made a decision that would alter the course of my life. I would pursue my dreams with or without my family's blessing. I would prove my mother wrong, not out of spite, but because I owed it to myself to honor the gift I had been given. The remainder of my senior year passed in a blur of minimal contact with my parents. I called my father, occasionally short conversations that carefully avoided the topic of my future plans. He would pass the phone to my mother, who would ask perfunctory questions about my business classes and nothing else. Graduation day arrived with its caps and gowns, its pomp and circumstance. As I scanned the audience during the ceremony, I spotted my father sitting alone, his expression a mixture of pride and sadness. My mother had not come. She wasn't feeling well, my father explained afterward, but we both knew the truth. She had chosen absence as her form of protest. With a business and English double major diploma in hand, but no reconciliation with my mother, I moved to New York City in late August to begin my MFA program. My father had slipped me some money, not enough to make a significant difference, but enough to communicate that he hadn't completely abandoned me. "Be careful," he said as he hugged me goodbye. New York is not Boston. The reality of New York hit me hard. The tiny apartment in Brooklyn that I shared with two other struggling writers, Zoe, a poet from Chicago, and Daniel, a playwright from Atlanta, was a far cry from the comfortable dorms of Northwestern. The bathroom was perpetually moldy, the heating unreliable, and the street noise constant. To afford rent and food while attending graduate school, I worked multiple jobs. Mornings started at 5 a.m. for my shift at a coffee shop in Manhattan, where I would serve lattes to Wall Street types until rushing to my afternoon classes. Evenings were split between tutoring high school students in English and picking up freelance editing work online. Weekends often included shifts at a bookstore in the village, where the employee discount on books was more valuable to me than the meager hourly wage. The exhaustion was bone deep, a constant companion, as I tried to balance work study and my own writing. There were nights when I would fall asleep at my desk, face pressed against the pages of a half-written story, only to be jolted awake by my alarm reminding me it was time for another day at the coffee shop. My diet consisted mainly of ramen noodles, day-old pastries from the coffee shop, and the occasional splurge on a real vegetable, when guilt about my health became too strong to ignore. I lost weight, developed dark circles under my eyes that no amount of concealer could hide, and caught every cold that circulated through the subway system. But despite the hardships, I found a freedom in New York that I had never experienced before. I was surrounded by people who took writing seriously, who understood the compulsion to put words on paper, who didn't question the validity of a life dedicated to storytelling. My roommate Zoe quickly became a close friend and staunch supporter. After particularly grueling days, we would sit on our fire escape, with mugs of cheap wine sharing our latest work and dreams for the future. "We're paying our dues now," she would say, "but someday we'll look back on this from our book tours and laugh." The occasional phone calls from my mother were exercises in restraint. She would inevitably ask if I had come to my senses yet about my career choice, suggesting job openings in Boston that would make use of your business degree at least. Each call left me drained and questioning my choices, the echo of all my sacrifices met with nothing but disappointment ringing in my ears. My father's support, while meaningful, remained secretive. He would send small checks with notes saying, "Don't tell your mother," and occasional encouraging texts about articles he had read about successful authors. It was a lifeline, but the continued division in my family was a wound that never fully healed. In my second semester, I found a new mentor in Professor Harris, a novelist whose debut book had won the National Book Award 10 years earlier. He took a special interest in my work, pushing me to dig deeper into my cultural background and to submit to publications despite my fear of rejection. "Rejection is part of a writer's life," he told me bluntly. "Get used to it. The only writers who never get rejected are the ones who never submit their work." Taking his advice, I began sending out my stories to literary magazines and journals. The rejection letters came quickly, each one a paper cut to my already fragile confidence. Some were form letters. We regret to inform you that your submission does not meet our current needs, while others offered brief feedback that, while meant to be helpful, often felt like confirmation of my mother's doubts. Your narrative lacks emotional resonance. The conflict feels manufactured rather than organic. The protagonist's motivations are unclear. Each criticism seemed to whisper in my mother's voice. See, you're not good enough. You should have listened to me. But Professor Harris would not let me give up. Every rejection is a badge of honor, he insisted. It means you're in the game. Keep writing, keep submitting, keep believing in your voice. And so I did, working on my stories in the pre-dawn hours before my coffee shop shift, during my lunch breaks, late into the night, after tutoring sessions. The rejections continued, but occasionally, very occasionally, an acceptance would arrive, a small beacon of validation in the darkness of doubt. 2 years into my MFA program, my life had fallen into a grueling but sustainable routine. My portfolio of publications was growing, albeit slowly, with stories appearing in small but respected literary journals. The pay was minimal, a contributor's copy, and perhaps $50 if I was lucky, but each acceptance was proof that someone somewhere valued my words. The financial strain, however, was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Student loan debt mounted, and despite working multiple jobs, I was barely staying afloat. My health began to suffer from the constant stress and lack of proper rest and nutrition. One particularly brutal winter week, when the heating in our apartment failed during a cold snap, I developed a persistent cough that eventually led to bronchitis. Unable to afford a doctor's visit, I tried to power through it with over-the-counter medications until I collapsed during a coffee shop shift. My manager called an ambulance, and I spent 2 days in the hospital diagnosed with pneumonia and severe exhaustion. The medical bills were devastating. In desperation, I called my parents. My father answered, concern evident in his voice when I explained the situation. He promised to send money right away. Then, surprisingly, my mother got on the phone. "This is what happens when you chase foolish dreams in expensive cities," she said, but her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. "Your father and I will help with the bills, but Valeria, maybe it's time to come home. You've tried this writing thing. You've gotten it out of your system. Come back to Boston, use your business degree, build a stable life." For a brief moment, the offer was tempting. The thought of home, of stability, of not having to count every penny and work until exhaustion, it had its appeal. But then I thought of my stories, of the characters who had become as real to me as the people in my life, of the worlds I had created and had yet to create. Could I really abandon them? "Thank you for helping with the bills," I said finally, "but I'm not coming home. Not yet. I need to finish what I started here." The reconciliation attempt ended there, with my mother's heavy sigh and terse goodbye. The money arrived the next day, enough to cover the medical bills, but not a penny more. A calculated gesture that communicated both care and disapproval. That Thanksgiving, against my better judgment, I returned to Boston for the holiday. My mother had invited the Petrovs' family friends, whose daughter Irina had recently graduated from medical school and accepted a position at Massachusetts General Hospital. The entire dinner felt like an orchestrated showcase of what Valeria could have been if she had listened to her mother. "So Valeria, Dr. Petrov asked between bites of turkey, "What exactly does one do with a master's in creative writing? Teach high school, perhaps?" Before I could answer, my mother jumped in. "Valeria is still figuring things out, but she has a business degree too, much more practical." The embarrassment of having my career belittled at my own family's table was almost unbearable. It was during this difficult period that I met Jackson at a literary event in Brooklyn. He was an editor at a small but respected publishing house, and he had attended the reading because one of his authors was featured. We struck up a conversation at the wine and cheese reception afterward, and he asked insightful questions about my work. "I'd love to read some of your stories," he said, handing me his card. "No promises, but I'm always looking for fresh voices." Our professional relationship quickly evolved into something more personal. Jackson understood the writing life in a way few others did. He knew the struggle, the rejection, the doubt, but also the joy, the fulfillment, the necessity of putting words on paper. Our early dates often involved him reading my latest drafts, offering feedback that was both kind and constructive. As my relationship with Jackson blossomed, I also found a new source of fulfillment in teaching creative writing at a community center in Harlem. The adult students came from all walks of life, retirees finally pursuing long-deferred dreams, working parents, stealing an hour for themselves between responsibilities, young adults seeking an expressive outlet beyond social media. Their enthusiasm and raw talent reminded me of why I had fallen in love with writing in the first place. "You're a natural teacher," the program director told me after observing one of my classes. "You have a gift for drawing out people's stories." Working with these students forced me to reconsider my definition of success. Was it publishing in prestigious journals, securing a book deal, making enough money to impress my mother? Or was it helping a 65-year-old grandmother find the words to tell her immigration story for her grandchildren? Was it watching a shy teenager discover his voice through poetry? Was it creating a community where stories mattered, where words had power? The contrast between my mother's definition of success, financial stability, social status, conventional achievement, and my evolving one became increasingly stark. I began to understand that perhaps we would never bridge this gap, that our values were too fundamentally different. As I approached the completion of my MFA program, I poured everything into my thesis, a novel manuscript based partly on immigrant family experiences, exploring the generational and cultural divides that can occur even in the most loving families. The faculty response was overwhelmingly positive, with my thesis committee praising the emotional depth and cultural authenticity of the work. "This is publishable," Professor Harris told me during my final review. "Not just as a thesis, but as a real novel. You've done something special here, Valeria." My MFA graduation ceremony was attended by Zoe Jackson and, to my surprise, my father. My mother was absent again, claiming a migraine, though we all knew the truth. As I accepted my diploma, I searched the audience for my father's face, finding him in the back row, his eyes glistening with what might have been pride or regret, or some complex emotion that had no name. After graduation, the real struggle began, finding stable employment in a notoriously competitive publishing industry. I applied for editorial assistant positions, marketing roles at publishing houses, literary agency jobs, anything that would keep me connected to the world of books while paying the bills. After dozens of applications and interviews, I was offered a position at a prestigious literary agency as an assistant to one of the senior agents. The catch: the salary was barely above minimum wage, with the understanding that the real compensation was the experience and connections I would gain. It was a difficult decision. Taking the job meant continuing to live on the financial edge, working side gigs to make ends meet, postponing any hope of paying down my student debt in a meaningful way. But it also meant staying in the literary world, building a network, and potentially finding a path to getting my own novel published. After a long night of discussing the pros and cons with Jackson, I accepted the position. "You've come this far," he said. "Don't give up now. We'll make it work somehow." And so I stepped into the next chapter of my journey, still determined to prove my mother wrong, but increasingly motivated by something beyond that initial defiance, a genuine belief in the value of my voice and my stories. The next 2 years at the literary agency were a masterclass in persistence. I worked long hours for minimal pay, answering phones, reading submissions, writing rejection letters, and occasionally offering input on manuscripts that showed promise. The irony of sending rejection letters similar to the ones I had received was not lost on me. Despite the demanding job, I continued to write my own fiction during early mornings and weekends. The novel I had begun as my thesis evolved and expanded as I applied the editorial skills I was learning at the agency. Jackson became my first reader, offering feedback chapter by chapter. "You're writing about your mother, you know," he observed one evening as we discussed a particularly difficult scene between my protagonist and her immigrant mother. "It's fiction," I protested. "The details are all different." Jackson smiled knowingly. "The emotions are real, though. That's what makes it powerful." He was right, of course. Though I had changed the setting, the circumstances, even the nationality of the characters, the emotional core of the story was deeply autobiographical. The struggle for understanding between a mother and daughter, separated by culture and dreams. I worked on the manuscript in secret, telling no one at the agency about it. There was an unspoken rule that assistants didn't pitch their own work to the agents they supported. It was considered presumptuous, unprofessional. So I kept my head down, did my job, and poured my creative energy into my novel during the hours that belonged to me alone. Jackson's support during this time was unwavering. He believed in my book when I doubted it, pushed me to keep writing, when exhaustion made it seem impossible, celebrated each completed chapter as a victory. Our relationship deepened into a partnership of mutual respect and encouragement. My communications with my parents remained strained but stable. Weekly phone calls with my father, occasional tense conversations with my mother that carefully avoided any mention of my writing. I sent them birthday and holiday cards, received similarly impersonal acknowledgements in return. We existed in a state of polite detachment. The wound of that final confrontation neither healed nor fully reopened. Then came the email that would change everything. I was at work sorting through my boss's correspondence when I noticed a message from Elaine Montgomery, a senior editor at Harper & Row, one of the major publishing houses. She had met Jackson at an industry event, and he had mentioned my manuscript to her. She was interested in reading it. My hands shook as I forwarded the email to my personal account. Was this a real opportunity, or would it lead to just another rejection? Jackson had put his professional reputation on the line by recommending my work. What if Elaine hated it? After agonizing over the decision, I sent the manuscript to Elaine with a brief professional cover letter. Then came the hardest part, waiting. Days stretched into weeks with no response. I checked my email, obsessively jumped every time my phone rang, imagined worst-case scenarios where Elaine not only rejected the book, but also complained to Jackson about wasting her time. 6 weeks later, as I was making my morning coffee before heading to work, the email arrived. Elaine loved the manuscript. She wanted to acquire it for Harper & Row. The email included an offer, an advance that, while modest by industry standards, was more money than I had ever seen at one time. It would be enough to pay off a significant portion of my student loans and provide some financial breathing room for the first time since I had left home. I read the email 3 times, certain there must be some mistake, some cruel joke. But it was real. My novel. The story I had carried inside me for years. The characters who had kept me company during lonely nights. The words I had written in defiance of my mother's disapproval would become a real book with my name on the cover. That night, Jackson took me out to celebrate at a restaurant far nicer than our usual haunts. As we toasted with champagne, I found myself overwhelmed by the journey that had led to this moment. I wish my mother could understand what this means. I admitted the joy of the achievement tinged with the persistent sadness of that unresolved relationship. I wish she could be happy for me. Jackson reached across the table to take my hand. She might surprise you. People can change when confronted with undeniable evidence that they were wrong. I wasn't so sure. My mother's disapproval had never been based on logic or evidence, but on deep-seated fears and values that a book deal, however significant to me, might not overcome. Still, as I sipped my champagne, I allowed myself to imagine a reconciliation, a moment of connection over this achievement. The decision to share the news with my parents was agonizing. Part of me wanted to keep it to myself to protect this fragile happiness from my mother's potential dismissal. But another part yearned for acknowledgement for my parents to finally see that my impractical choice had led to something tangible and real. I called my father first, my heart racing as I told him about the book deal. His reaction was everything I had hoped for. Genuine pride, excitement, even a few tears that he tried to disguise with a cough. "I always knew you had it in you, Valerochka," he said, using the childhood nickname that I hadn't heard in years. "Even when you were little, the stories you told, they were special." Then came the harder part. "Does Mum know yet?" I asked. My father hesitated. "No, but I think you should tell her yourself. She might never admit it, but she keeps all the literary magazines with your stories. I've seen them hidden in her dresser drawer." This revelation stunned me. My mother secretly collecting my publications. It seemed impossible, yet my father had no reason to lie. With renewed hope, I asked him to put her on the phone. Her voice was cautious when she came on the line. "Valeria, is everything all right?" I took a deep breath and shared my news, trying to keep my tone neutral, neither seeking approval nor anticipating criticism. There was a long silence when I finished speaking. "A book, ma'am," she finally said. "Your stories will be a real book." It wasn't quite enthusiasm, but it wasn't dismissal either. "Yes, Mom, Harper & Row is a major publisher. It's a big deal in the writing world." Another pause. "Will you make money from this book, enough to live on?" It was such a typical question from her that I almost laughed. "The advance is good, and if the book sells well, there will be royalties. And they might want more books after this one." She said, and I could almost see her recalibrating her understanding of my career choice. "Well, your father seems very proud." It was as close to approval as I was likely to get. After the call, I mailed a copy of the signed contract and the publisher's announcement of the acquisition to my parents' home, a tangible proof of my achievement. Let my mother hold the evidence in her hands, I thought. Let her see in black and white that my dream was not just a fantasy. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The editing process was intense, with Elaine pushing me to deepen certain aspects of the story, clarify motivations, sharpen dialogue. There were moments of frustration and doubt, times when I questioned my abilities, but the end result was undeniably stronger than my original draft. As the publication date approached, marketing plans were developed. There would be a book tour, modest, just a few cities, but including Boston. My author photo was taken, my bio-crafted advance copies sent to reviewers. It was surreal to see my name on the cover of a real book, to hold in my hands the physical manifestation of years of work and sacrifice. One particularly meaningful moment came when Professor Diane Winters, my undergraduate mentor from Northwestern, wrote a glowing endorsement for the book jacket. Valeria Sokolova writes with extraordinary insight about the complex bonds between mothers and daughters and the courage it takes to forge one's own path. A stunning debut from a major new talent. As advance reviews began to trickle in, mostly positive with a few measured criticisms, I found myself experiencing a new kind of anxiety. Soon my words would be out in the world for anyone to read, to judge, to interpret. There would be no taking them back, no more revisions or second thoughts. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Through it all, Jackson remained my rock, celebrating each milestone, soothing each moment of panic. Remember why you wrote this book. He would remind me when I spiraled into worry about reviews or sales figures. You wrote it because these were the stories you needed to tell. Everything else is secondary. As the publication date drew nearer, I couldn't help but wonder, would my mother read my book? And if she did, would she finally understand me? The morning of my book release felt both momentous and strangely ordinary. I woke up in the apartment I now shared with Jackson, made coffee, and checked my phone for messages. There were congratulatory texts from friends, an email from my editor wishing me luck, but nothing from my parents. My first official signing was scheduled for that evening at a major bookstore in Manhattan. As the day progressed, my nerves intensified. What if no one came? What if they came but hated the book? What if I froze when asked to read aloud? Jackson sensed my anxiety and took the afternoon off work to help me prepare. He listened patiently as I practiced reading, excerpts helped me choose an outfit that projected professional confidence and reminded me to eat something despite my nervous stomach. "You've earned this moment," he said as we headed to the bookstore. "No matter what happens tonight, remember that." The bookstore had set up rows of chairs, a podium, and a table for signing. As people began to arrive, I was shocked to see familiar faces from various parts of my life. Former classmates from Northwestern colleagues, from the literary agency, students from my community center classes, friends of Jackson's, who had become my friends too. Even Professor Harris had made the trip from NYU. But the biggest surprise came just before the event was scheduled to begin. As I was reviewing my notes one last time, I looked up to see my father standing at the back of the room, his eyes scanning the crowd anxiously. My heart leapt as I made my way through the gathering audience to reach him. "Dad, you came. I had no idea you were planning to." He embraced me tightly, cutting off my words. When he pulled back, I was shocked to see tears in his eyes. "I wouldn't miss this, Valerichka. Not for anything." "Is Mom—" I glanced around, hoping against hope that she might have come too. My father shook his head. She couldn't make it, but she knows I'm here." There was something in his expression, a mixture of sadness and determination, that suggested there was more to the story. Before I could probe further, the bookstore manager announced it was time to begin. I made my way to the podium, my father taking a seat in the front row beside Jackson, who greeted him warmly. The event was a blur of emotions. The strange experience of reading my words aloud to a room full of attentive faces, the thoughtful questions from the audience, the line of people waiting for me to sign their copies of my book. But throughout it all, I was acutely aware of my father's presence, of his beaming face as he watched me navigate this new territory. After the last book was signed and the crowd had dispersed, my father approached the signing table, his expression serious. "We need to talk, Valeria. Can we go somewhere quiet?" We found a small coffee shop still open nearby. As we settled into a corner booth with our drinks, my father took a deep breath. "I need to apologize to you," he said, his accent thicker than usual, a sign of emotional distress. "For that night when I said nothing, when I did not stand up for you." The memory of that painful silence still had the power to hurt, but seeing my father's genuine remorse softened the sting. "Why didn't you say anything, Dad? You always supported my writing in secret. Why not openly?" He stared into his coffee cup, shoulders slumped. "Fear, I suppose. Fear of your mother's anger, yes, but more than that, fear that she might be right, that we had sacrificed so much to come to America, and for what? For our daughter to struggle as we had struggled, to be broke, to be considered unimportant in this society that values only certain kinds of success. He looked up at me, his eyes damp. I was wrong. We were both wrong. You found your own path, your own kind of success, and I am so, so proud of you. I should have said so sooner. I should have stood by you. His words unlocked something in me, a knot of hurt and resentment that had been lodged in my chest for years. Thank you for saying that, Dad. It means more than you know. Your mother... He hesitated. She is proud too in her way. She watched your interview online, the one with the literary website. She wouldn't admit it, but I saw her smiling at certain parts. The thought of my mother secretly watching interviews with me, collecting my published stories. It painted a more complex picture than the implacable disapproval I had carried in my mind. Perhaps there was more nuance to her feelings than I had allowed myself to see. In the weeks that followed, my book received critical acclaim beyond anything I had dared to hope for. The New York Times Book Review featured it prominently, praising its unflinching examination of generational trauma and cultural displacement. Sales were strong for a literary debut, and my publisher began making noises about a second book. The television interview was the most terrifying part of the publicity tour, a morning show segment about emerging voices in fiction. I spoke about the immigrant experience, about the tensions between generations, about the universal desire to be understood by those we love most. I did not mention my mother directly, but I knew if she was watching, she would recognize herself in my words. And apparently she was watching. A week after the interview aired, I received a text from my father. Your mother saw you on TV. She has been quiet since. I think she's thinking deeply about many things. Then unexpectedly, my mother herself appeared at my apartment door in Brooklyn. She stood awkwardly in the hallway, clutching her purse, looking smaller and older than I remembered. May I come in? She asked, her voice lacking its usual certainty. I stepped aside, too shocked to speak. My mother had never visited me in New York before, had never seen any of my apartments, had never shown interest in the life I had built for myself. She glanced around the space. The bookshelves Jackson and I had built together, the comfortable but worn sofa, the desk by the window where I wrote. It was humble by her standards, certainly, but it was clean and bright, and filled with things I loved. You have made a home here, she observed, and I couldn't tell if it was approval or surprise in her voice. We sat across from each other at my small kitchen table, the silence stretching between us like a living thing. Finally she spoke. I watched you on the television. You spoke well, very professional. Thank you, I said cautiously. She fiddled with the clasp of her purse. Your book. I have read it. This revelation stunned me. You read my novel? She nodded. Twice, actually. It is not what I expected. What did you expect? I thought it would be angry, that you would make the mother a monster. She met my eyes directly. I thought you would punish me through your words. The honesty of this admission took my breath away. That wasn't my intention, Mom. The book isn't about you, not really. It's about the misunderstandings that can happen between people who love each other but see the world differently. Yes, she said slowly. I recognize that. The mother in your book, she is not evil. She is afraid. Afraid for her daughter, afraid of the unknown, afraid of the sacrifices being wasted. She paused. Like me. It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get from my proud, stubborn mother. I reached across the table and took her hand. She stiffened momentarily, then relaxed. I never meant to disappoint you, Mom. I just needed to find my own way. I know this now. She squeezed my hand. It was hard for me to understand that your happiness might look different from what I imagined. In Russia, success means security, stability. Art is beautiful, yes, but not reliable. I wanted to protect you from struggle. I understand that, I said. But sometimes the struggle is worth it when you're doing what you love. She nodded, though I could see she wasn't entirely convinced. We were not suddenly going to see eye to eye on everything. The gulf between our worldviews was too wide, too deeply rooted in different experiences and values. But we were talking, really talking, perhaps for the first time in years. As my mother prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Your father and I will come to your Boston event, if that is all right with you. I'd like that very much, I said, feeling a tentative hope unfurling inside me. The Boston book signing was held at a bookstore not far from where I had grown up. As I prepared to address the audience, I spotted my parents in the second row. My father beamed with obvious pride, while my mother sat stiffly beside him, her expression guarded but attentive. During the Q&A, a college student asked about the autobiographical elements in my novel. How much of this story comes from your own experience, she wanted to know. I glanced at my mother before answering. All fiction contains elements of truth, I said carefully. Writers draw from their own lives, their own emotions, even when the specific details are invented. The feelings in this book, the desire to honor your parents while also honoring yourself, the struggle to bridge cultural gaps, the search for identity, those are certainly drawn from my experience. But the characters have taken on lives of their own. They aren't simply stand-ins for real people. After the signing, my mother approached the table with a copy of my book. "Would you sign this for me?" she asked formally. I gave my other copy to Mrs. Petrova. She was quite impressed that my daughter is a published author. I couldn't help but smile at this revelation. My mother bragging about my writing to the very people she had once held up as examples of proper success. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. As I signed the book, I noticed my mother studying the page where I had listed my acknowledgements. Among the names, Jackson, my professors, my friends. I had included my parents, to Natasha and Mikhail Sokolova, who crossed oceans so I could have choices. Thank you for the sacrifice and the courage. My mother ran her finger over these words, her expression softening. You thanked us, she said quietly, even after everything. Of course I did, I replied. I wouldn't be here without you, not just because you brought me to America, but because your expectations, however difficult they were to live up to, pushed me to work harder, to be more determined to prove myself. In a strange way, your disapproval made me a better writer. For the first time in years, my mother smiled at me. A real smile, not the tight formal one she used in social situations. Perhaps I did something right then, even if by accident. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. There were still topics we avoided, still moments of tension when our fundamental differences in worldview became apparent. But it was a beginning, a crack in the wall that had separated us for so long. As I settled into my new life as a published author, I moved into my own apartment. A small but sunny one-bedroom in a quieter part of Brooklyn. It was the first place that was truly mine, not shared with roommates, not chosen primarily for affordability. It was a symbol of my independence, of the fact that I had made it on my own terms. Jackson and I continued our relationship, supporting each other's creative and professional endeavors, building a partnership based on mutual respect and understanding. We talked about marriage sometimes, about children, about the future. But we were in no rush. We had time to let things unfold naturally. I began work on my second novel, no longer driven by the need to prove anything to anyone. This book would be written purely for the joy of creation, for the satisfaction of crafting characters and worlds that might resonate with readers. It was liberating to write without the weight of defiance, without the shadow of my mother's disappointment hanging over each page. Looking back on the journey from that terrible night when I walked away from my parents' house, tears burning my eyes, to where I am now, I can see how pain can fuel determination, how rejection can strengthen resolve. My mother's words, all my sacrifices met with nothing but disappointment, had cut me deeply. But they had also paradoxically set me free. Free to pursue my own definition of success, free to discover my own voice, free to write the stories that only I could tell. I understand my mother better now. I see how her fierce protection, her practical concerns, her fear of my suffering, these all came from love, however imperfectly expressed. And I hope she understands me better too, that she sees my writing not as a rejection of her values, but as an honoring of the very freedom she sacrificed so much to give me. We are different, my mother and I. We may always be. But we are finding ways to bridge the gap, to accept each other's choices, to recognize that love can exist even amid disagreement. It is a work in progress, like all the most important stories. Have you ever had to walk away from someone's disapproval to follow your dreams? How did you find the courage to pursue your own path despite others' doubts? Share your experience in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might be struggling to believe in themselves when others don't. Remember, sometimes the greatest motivation comes from the words you can't. Proving them wrong might just lead you to your purpose. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you the strength to follow your own heart, whatever obstacles you may face.